Hello, and welcome back to the Mathematicians podcast, the show where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we're going back to square one with the first name on the list. When filtered by mathematicians from the Indian tradition, it's Baudhayana. First, may I wish everyone a happy new year and a toast, as the podcast is now officially 1 year old. It is a pleasure to be back behind my keyboard after an extended time away, and I shall remind listeners that this year the podcast will be coming out on an as-ready basis as I prioritise the nesting needed to welcome my new daughter into the world. Rather than me telling you one of my fully truthful and oddly tedious stories about my former friends, or my time as an ice cream van driver, or, as you will discover this year, the stage of my career where I was a crystal vendor, I shall instead start this episode with a series recap. To remind listeners about what happened in the 50 episodes last year, we started at the beginning of written recorded history with the oldest name we know of someone writing or doing maths. Naturally, this was not the start of maths, just the first name, and so we called it Somewhere in the Middle. We then spent 2,500 years bouncing around the cultures of the Mediterranean Sea, primarily the Greeks and Romans, following the stories of the bigger names of the mathematical world. The goal was to cover all of the people on my list, which makes me realise I don't think I've told you about my list yet. I have about 1,500 names, drawn up by Professor David Joyce of Clark University, big thank you to him, and I have now crossed off about 50 names from that list. Although there are gaps. Some of these are from mathematicians who are known by name but not known for their work, or perhaps their output was too small to fill 20 minutes. But many of the names have been skipped because their story does not link directly with the Hellenistic tradition. To include them would have been incongruous. What I intend to do at this stage is return to the start of the list, with the second name on there, and start again, but this time following a different strand of the story. What this means is that we must now assume that all of the ideas that have been learnt and disseminated must be unassumed, and we return with a clean slate, or indeed a clean oral tradition that was later recorded on palm leaves or birch bark. However, there is one last disclaimer before we launch into the story. There are still going to be gaps from my list. I will now be following the mathematicians of the combined regions of Persia and India, but I shall not at this stage be discussing Chinese mathematicians, or indeed mathematicians from Oceania, Africa, or the Americas. One day I hope to be able to return again and follow these threads. For now, the year is 800 BCE, or so I would suggest. We actually know very little about the origin story of today's mathematician, as he did not write about himself directly, and written accounts only emerged much after his death, although 800 BCE is the traditionally approximate time frame. Baudhayana was a Vedic priest, as so many early mathematicians were, and his connection with maths was more closely defined as a set of instructions for constructing altars and sacrificial areas, where the maths was more a means to an end. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's explore the word Vedic a little more. To be Vedic means to be associated with the Vedas. These are a large set of religious poetry, history, or instruction that developed in India between 1500 and 500 BCE. The works were originally an oral tradition, and a Vedic priest or scholar would be able to recite the entirety of the work. However, they have now been written down and preserved as a literary tradition. The Vedas include 4 primary works: the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. Although the Vedic texts also include the commentaries and supplementary manuals and sutras. The Vedic tradition is primarily a religious frame. However, this is true in the sense that most scholarly work in ancient times is set in a religious frame, in part because the village priest is one of the first roles to be specialised to allow for non-labour time in which to construct a scholarly work. In the same sense that most pagan mathematicians were, pagan, or most later Roman mathematicians were Christian in nature. So we should be cautious to consider it only in the religious context. We might talk about Vedic law, Vedic philosophy, or indeed Vedic mathematics, or anything really. Modern historians would refer to the Vedic tradition in the same way that they might say ancient Egyptian or Hellenistic. It is a collection of thought, language, priorities, and yes, religion. Some listeners might hear me talk about religion in India and assume that I mean Hindu. This is where I will get a little uncomfortable about my understanding, but I believe it is correct to say that Vedic religion is an ancestor to Hinduism, and in many ways a precursor. Many modern Hindus will still consider the Vedas to be divinely inspired, and as such, sacred. However, that does not mean that all the practices mandated by the Vedas are followed by Hindus today. There is nuance. Similarly, some branches of Buddhist and Jain thought still hold them as sacred, but not devotional texts. So, in summary, Vedic is not the same as Hindu. I tried to research the origin of the Hindu religion so that I could give you an idea of when we will see it in this series, but as it turns out, it is not that easy to define. Unlike with the religions that coalesce around a single figure, like Jesus or Siddhartha Gautama, Hinduism evolved and transformed over the course of nearly 2,000 years. Whilst we are talking about religion, some of you may have noticed that in the first series I have been somewhat scathing about Christianity. I feel confident in my position here because I used to be a Christian and speak from a place of knowing. I have not yet had the opportunity to discuss many Jewish thinkers, although again I feel as confident to be blunt as I am with my knowledge of the Old Testament. Whilst I'm not going to go out of my way to be disrespectful to religions per se, I am generally sceptical of the intentions of all organised religion. So my intention with discussing the religious aspects of the Vedic traditions is to depict them as accurately and honestly as I'm able, and reserve my opinions up to the point that I learn of reasons to have a negative opinion. So, to summarise the Vedic religion as simply as I can and without intentionally misrepresenting it, it was focused on fire sacrifices and ritual practices, rather than about personal relationships or worship. The goal was harmony with the cosmos, more than personal moral salvation. There was a heavy use of hymns as a form of spiritual power, which, if spoken correctly, would produce these real-world effects. So, I think that mostly gets us on the same page with regards to the religious context. Back to where we were. Baudhayana was a Vedic priest. He is most notable as the author of the Sulba Sutras, which make up part of the Vedic canon of literature. The rough translation of Sulba Sutra would be instructions for measuring with rope. And just like that, we see a spontaneous spark of mathematical inquiry, similar to what we saw in the earliest evolutions of mathematics in Greece. That is, the realization that if you play with a piece of string for long enough, you will notice that it makes some interesting patterns. Admittedly, this is not necessarily the first piece of proper maths that ever exists. Universally, in ancient Babylonian, Celtic, Chinese, African, Indian, basically everywhere, the first use of mathematics is generally noticing the patterns in the moon, sun, and stars. Early astronomy, sequences, modular arithmetic, you name it. You can see mathematics just by looking up. And as I've said on many occasions, I have very little respect for astronomy or astronomers. My preferred version of real maths is the type that one can practice entirely in one's mind. The idea that a single person with infinite time trapped in a dark prison cell could reconstruct all mathematics, well, this is what gets me excited. Sadly, astronomy does not fit that bill, because you need to be able to look up. Given the nature of the Vedic tradition, creating the correct sacrifices at the correct time is essential for pleasing the gods, so a study of astronomy grew in tandem. But the Sulba Sutras, instructions with string, I think is more interesting as a mathematical art. To quote from Dr. G. Tibbet on the Sulba Sutras, "The want of some norm by which to fix the right time for the sacrifices gave the first impulse to astronomical observations. Urged by this want, the priests remained watching night after night the advance of the moon through the circle of the nakshatras, and day after day the alternate progress of the sun towards the north and the south. The law of phonetics were investigated because the wrath of the gods followed the wrong pronunciation of a single letter of the sacrificial formulas. Grammar and etymology had the task of securing the right understanding of the holy texts. So, how does the Solva Sutras fit in? Well, this comes down to the construction of sacrificial altars. If you want to please the gods, the method of your sacrifice needs to be perfect, phonetically precise, accurately timed with the stars, but also exacting in construction. Now, did you know that if you use a piece of string to measure the length of one thing, you can then move the string somewhere else, and the lengths will be equal? Well, I learnt this from my resistance materials teacher at school, in the form of the quotation, "Mark, don't measure." This sits alongside some great quotes such as, "A man with a tape measure knows how long something is, a man with 2 tape measures knows nothing," and his other great one of, "A short pencil is better than a long memory." Baudhayana took this message to heart. That is the "Mark, don't measure" one, not the one about the pencil. His aim was to be able to share his knowledge of how the gods wished their altars to be constructed, and he wished to do this using the tools and instruments that everyone would have access to. Rope. Again, Dr. Thibaut says, "Whenever a figure with right angles, square or oblong, had to be drawn on the ground, care had to be taken that the sides really stood at right angles to each other. For would the Ahavaniya fire have carried up the offerings of the sacrificer to the gods if its hearth had not the shape of a perfect square?" To give you an idea of what types of altars or Vedi we are constructing, when following the Solva Sutras, you may wish to do an image search online. But so far, I have not been too cowardly to try to describe something that is inherently visual, and I see no reason to stop now. Generally speaking, the altars are in the shapes of animals. So I'm looking at a few images here of birds, a turtle, a mosaic square or circle, these sorts of shapes. The construction would have been clay bricks laid out on the flat ground, with sacrificial fires placed at specific points. The bricks themselves are generally either square, rectangular, or right triangular. From one Vedi to the next, the area must always be equal, regardless of design shape, and with the same quantity of bricks. There is also a general consistency of brick area, such that all bricks have equal area, or weight, or you might even say can be formed from identical lumps of clay. Now, for all my listeners who like to fact check and write in angry emails, it is not strictly true that all bricks are equal. There are some special symbolic or structural bricks that are different, but most bricks are equal in area for ritual and geometric consistency. But a minority of special bricks are allowed or prescribed to differ. Now, I'm sure you have already worked out the importance of mathematics here. We have 3 primary shapes: squares, oblongs or rectangles, and triangles, with equal area. So we are essentially performing quadrature. That is in the language of the Greeks, or at least the Latinization of the language of the Greeks. Cast your mind back to how the ancient Greeks liked to do quadrature. Haha, yes, rope. Baudhayana gives plenty of instructions for how to create the specific bricks needed for the altars, with the invariant of area. This means I get the delight of now quoting from Dr. Thibaut, who is in turn quoting from the text of the Solva Sutras ascribed to Baudhayana. "The chord, which is stretched across in the diagonal of a square, produces an area of double the size." Hold on. That sounds awfully close to Pythagoras' theorem. But wait, there's more. The chord, stretched in the diagonal of an oblong, produces both areas, which the chords forming the longer and the shorter sides of an oblong produce separately. Now, this is essentially the same as the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. Admittedly, it uses different language. Pythagoras prefers the right triangle with a hypotenuse, whereas Baudhayana prefers the diagonal of the oblong. Pythagoras states the square, whereas Baudhayana implies this as the base unit. But these are essentially equivalent statements. So we check the birth date, shall we? Let's see. I think Pythagoras was 570 BCE, and Baudhayana is 800-ish BCE, which is outstanding that Baudhayana discovered Pythagoras' theorem 230 years before he was born. Or maybe we should just start calling it Baudhayana's theorem. I recently attended a conference with a delightful talk on colonialism in mathematics. If I haven't recommended her already, go read Subhadra Das's book, it's really good. One of the main topics of the talk was, should we change the names of things in mathematics to reflect the true history rather than the traditional history? It's a great debate with really convincing arguments in all directions. Sometimes I think it's preferable to stop calling something for instance, a Galton board. In this case, because Galton was a horrible eugenicist and invented statistics in order to justify his white supremacism. So instead, we might call it a binomial distribution board. It just feels nicer in the mouth. But there's also a good argument for not renaming something, like, say, the Fibonacci sequence to the Pingala sequence, because of the extent to which the two people developed the idea in the minds of the masses. So here, Pingala did write down the numbers in relation to poetic meter, but Fibonacci expounded on the mathematics. I'm actually very excited to talk about the Fibonacci sequence, or Fibonacci himself more generally. As a spoiler, in the same work that he introduced the sequence, he also formalized base 10 notation and the, quote, Arabic numerals to the Western world. So he was slightly more memorable than Pingala. Well, what about Pythagoras' theorem then? Should we be calling it Baudhayana's theorem? Pythagoras definitely did not invent it first, but then so too is it unlikely that Baudhayana got there first either. He is the first person we know of, but that's hardly conclusive. Many people would say that we call it Pythagoras' theorem out of a sense of colonialism, that it's an example of white supremacy to prefer yet another old white guy to an Indian guy. But I think this description is a little lazy. Samos is only a 30-minute swim from mainland Turkey. These days we would champion a mathematician from Turkey as going against the colonial grain. Similarly, Pythagoras is only an establishment figure in our own academic lineage. If you were growing up in India over the centuries, you would be holding Baudhayana as a similar establishment near-mythical figure. I'd be curious to discover, and I'm sure we will in time, when the Indian tradition starts to take inspiration from Greek tradition, if at all. Honestly, I don't yet know what the majority of our Indian scholars would have called the a squared plus b squared equals c squared relation. So I don't think it's preferable to change the name on colonial grounds. My understanding for why we in the West use that name, Pythagoras, is that for thousands of years, that's who we believe invented it. History was mainly invented in the past, but the study of history is a constantly evolving process, and it's only in relatively recent centuries that Western scholars would have discovered the original work of the Vedas. So for us, and of course by us I mean Northern Europeans, Pythagoras is the very natural traditional name. My favourite argument on this topic is that by now it's almost too late to change anything. Only a small percentage of the population engages with maths in a meaningful way. So just imagine how much backlash there would be from simply the English school system if we changed the name at this late stage, let alone the rest of the world. For me, it doesn't really matter who came up with it first. A rose would be as sweet if said by any other name. So let's just call it Pythagoras' theorem, because that's the one that we all tend to know, at least in the English-speaking world. What it means, though, is that we can talk about the history and discuss the creators around this early mathematics and use Pythagoras' theorem and the contention that it brings up as a jumping off point for a wider discussion about mathematics and who invented it. So let's get back to mathematics, shall we, and what Baudhayana can say about it. Beyond finding the algorithms needed to create squares that are of equal area to a given triangles and rectangles, the work of the Silva Sutras also contains some interesting statements about circles. One example of an algorithm to construct a square from a circle is takes the diameter of the circle, divides it into 15 parts, and then subtracts 2 of these parts to get the side of the square that is the equivalent area. So this would be implying that pi is approximately 3.004, which will be a delight for the engineers listening to the podcast. Another method involves taking the diagonal of the square and dividing it by 2, then rotating this half diagonal to one of the sides of the square and letting part of it extend, taking the extension beyond the square, finding the first third of it, and then making the half width of the square plus this extra third the new radius of the circle. This would very pleasingly give a value of pi as equal to the square root of 10, or 3.162, which is a remarkably close approximation for pi. Although long-time listeners of the show will remember episode 1 with Ames, we had an approximation of pi of 256 divided by 81, or 3.16049. So even though Baudhayana is about 900 years later, he's still a third decimal place less accurate. One thing I've not yet pointed out is that Baudhayana is not the only author of the Solva Sutras, and we shall see other approximations of pi as we get on to other mathematicians. Although, on the topic of approximations of interesting values, it's not just pi that is of interest to Baudhayana. We also have an approximation given for the square root of 2, so that is the diagonal along the unit square, which he lists as 1 plus a third plus 1 over 3 times 4, take away 1 over 3 times 4 times 34. Noticing that the difference between root 2 and that fraction of 577 divided by 408 is approximately 2 times 10 to the negative 6. So that is blindingly accurate. For this, I shall quote the translation: "The measure is to be increased by a third, and by a fourth, and decreased by a 34th. That is its diagonal, approximately." What I like about this is the description is recursive and builds upon the last fraction given, and it uses the word approximately. Beyond this more basic mensuration, we also see the rules for perimeters and areas of shapes, and some procedures for practical measurements, rather than simply esoteric proofs. One interesting thing to note here is in many of the sections, Baudhayana notes that there are multiple methods that could be used, and compares them to select the rule that is more accurate. This suggests that he was appreciative of when he was doing an approximation versus an exacting method, and was aware of the tolerance of approximation. Another thing we see in the Solva Sutras is a geometric approach to what we would now consider to be a quadratic equation, something in the form of ax squared equals c, or more challengingly, ax squared plus bx equals c. Again, you might recall when a similar piece of mathematics was solved in the Greek tradition, but from now on, I'm going to try to avoid the temptation to constantly be comparing and cross-referencing the work by Indian scholars to their contemporary Greeks, or even pitting them against each other to see who got there first. It is interesting to note some of the origins and originality, and to remember that the Greeks didn't do everything first, but I worry that it will undermine the brilliance of the Indian scholars if I am only ever talking about them in reference to the Greek standard, especially as everything pales in comparison to the gold standard of the Islamic Golden Age. Another thing to note is interesting from the work of the Solva Sutras is Baudhayana's commitment to mathematical rules being instructions for craftspeople. The work was meant to be memorized, remembering that the origins of the Solva Sutras emerged before a written tradition and were only transcribed later. This meant that the instructions needed to be simple enough to be memorized and then repeatable. Everything had to be portable, teachable, and verifiable. This means that we are seeing mathematics as a problem-oriented engineering-style strategy for sacred structures. And if you permit me one more cross-comparison to the Greek philosophy of mathematics, more as a cosmological understanding of how the universe is built, in the Vedic tradition, mathematics is a technical profession. Beyond his mathematical work in the Solva Sutras, the instructions of chord, Baudhayana is also attributed to the work of the Dharma Sutras. So this is the instructions on ethical and social law. With the word dharma, we could think of it as the correct conduct that one must possess. This being the personal virtue or social responsibility, as well as the adherence to a sacred law. In the Dharma Sutras, he puts an emphasis on personal virtues such as truthfulness, self-restraint and moderation, kindness and hospitality, generosity, humility towards teachers and elders, with a particular focus on the control of strong emotions like anger and greed. These dharmas cut across different stages of one's life, whether they're a child, or a student, or a householder, or forest dweller. In general, he encourages an awareness of one's actions and reflections before one acts, with the intent of avoiding harm for others. He also points to a structure of responsibility to three key principles of divine cosmic law, tradition, and then just general habits of good people, suggesting that a moral conformity is more harmonious. Again, to quote, "The law is taught in each Veda, in accordance with which we will explain it. What is given in the tradition is the second, and the conventions of cultured people are the third. Now, cultured people are those who are free from envy and pride, possess just a jar full of grain, and are free from covetousness, hypocrisy, arrogance, greed, folly, and anger. I'm drawn to this reference of only possessing just a jar full of grain, just enough to get by, no more, no less, stripping life down to its bare necessities. And yet he felt that for people who needed the minimum possible possessions, a crucial possession that he chose to give them was mathematics. And with that, I think it's time to tie a knot around Baudhayana's Solva Sutras and look to the next time on the podcast where we will investigate a mathematician who wrote another text. Let me just check my notes here. Also the Solva Sutras, except this time coming from the mind of Apastamba. Before we go, I would like to thank you for being patient with me as it took longer than normal to produce this episode. As I've said many times, I'm going to have another baby in March and the podcast is slowing down. Please do get in touch with me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod. I really do love hearing from people. I'd also like to give a particular thank you to Patrick, who has encouraged me to keep going with the podcast where I might otherwise have had much a longer hiatus. If you too are very keen to see the show continue and want to share your support, I would gratefully take you up on the offer. You can leave me a tip at ko-fi.com. My link is in the description. So, if it sutras you, please do join me next week where we will discuss Apastamba's Solva Sutras. Until then, goodbye! The music today is Dance Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.